This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Welcome to the BiCurean podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is BiCurean, you ask?
While you may not necessarily have a mental concept of BiCurean, partially maybe because it's a made-up word, you embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the BiCurean moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the BiCurean.
Hi, welcome to the BiCurean podcast. I'm Aisala.
And I'm Eric.
And this show is, so as we're nearing the end of Black History Month, we wanted to talk a little bit about the ways in which Black people have contributed to our history and maybe been a little bit overlooked or a lot, the history of Black history, and encourage folks to keep this awareness as they step into the rest of the year, because Black history is also just history.
So, I'm not even going to lie. This sort of came up partially because I have started to find an interest in almost the etymology of things, like where did this come from? And it did start with the conversation around, so why is there a Black History Month? I mean, I get fundamentally why. I think it's a great idea. But I can't honestly say that I have any knowledge of, when it even started, what prompted it. So we did some research on that, as you do.
The royal we, yes.
Yes.
And I have to say, like, when we were talking about the show, we talked about different topics, and I was thinking this might be a fun topic to dig into a little bit. And then you asked that question, what's the history of Black history? And I was like, wow, actually, I don't know. I feel like it's just always been there, which...
And don't we say that about a lot of things? Like
yeah.
The show we did on Columbus Day, and then realizing there was actually quite a bit of history to it. It was older than I had thought it was, and yet I guess I didn't know really how old it was. But with regards to Black History Month, what did you find? Well,
so there's a few things that I'll touch on, and then we can do a little back and forth around it. One of the really interesting things to me is it was started by a historian named Carter G. Woodson, and it was created in 1926, although he conceived of it in 1915. And what he did actually was create Negro History Week, which was the second week of February. So that's where it started. And it was partially because he held a symposium, and a bunch of people showed up. Like, it was 3 weeks in February, and there was standing room only. People just traveled to attend it. And he thought, wow, there's a lot of interest.
Yeah.
Let's, thousands of African Americans traveled from across the country to see exhibits highlighting the progress their people had made since the destruction of slavery. And that was in 1915. And so he was like, well, obviously there's interest in getting this information out there. So that's where he conceived of starting Negro History Week, which he then implemented in 1926.
Interesting. So when did it become a month?
I want to say that it was officially deemed a month in 1976.
So
however,
quite a while later.
Right, but but it started being practiced as a month before that. What it is actually every year the president declares the month Black History Month, so it's not an ongoing thing, and declares the theme.
Really?
Yeah. And so this year's theme is voting.
More like almost like suffrage type.
African Americans and the vote, and it's in honor of the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, 1920, granting women's suffrage, and the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment, 1870, giving Black men the right to vote.
Oh.
So there's a little bit of history for you.
Yeah, and I admit that, we try to stay up on topics. We are, we do this show and try to keep current events and do deep dives and stuff. And I will be the first to admit I didn't know very much about Black History Month. One of the things that you brought up was interesting to me. You've said the month that it is a couple of times, February, as to why it was actually deemed in that.
Right. One of the things that I thought, I've heard this joke before, like, why is the shortest month of the year Black History Month? And, and I've always kind of wondered about that, but I actually didn't ever look into it until you asked that question. And it's, Woodson chose that week because it covered the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, who's February 14th, and Abraham Lincoln, February 12th. And if you dig in a little bit, it was more because of tradition. Like that was those were birthdays that were celebrated traditionally in the Black community. But he had some concerns about that in terms of he didn't really think that great men made history, and he didn't want to necessarily perpetuate that. Yeah. However, he also did want to do something that drew on that history, but hoped to kind of bring forward more awareness that, for example, Abraham Lincoln, in his opinion, and I would support this, didn't necessarily free the slaves. It was the Union soldiers doing the work in the trenches.
Right.
Right. And there were Black soldiers in that. And so so the way that Woodson looks at it, I think kind of is a lot more empowering.
Yeah.
For all citizens, right? But also for Black citizens. And so he wanted to bring in that tradition of commemorating that past, but he hoped to expand it to something that was a lot more about people celebrating. And I think that's happened.
Absolutely.
Achievements and entrepreneurs and history.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think it has been a valuable resource for awareness around certain things. I can remember back when I was in grade school, like really paying attention to whatever sort of, I think you mentioned, like there was themes and stuff. And now that you mentioned that, I do recall that we did sort of dig in on those things. And, it's reasons that I know names like George Washington Carver and things like that. So it has had some value for sure. Just getting the information and knowledge around it. So,
yeah, this he said he believed that we should focus on the countless Black men and women who had contributed to the advance of human civilization. And I just thought that was a really powerful approach. And yeah, like the themes, like it's funny because I follow things like you said, like history and deep dives. And I didn't think about the fact that this was the anniversary of women's suffrage and the sesquicentennial for Black men getting the right to vote. And those were actually big steps, and they weren't really that far away, right? Like it's a few generations, and those things were.
We've had a lot of guests on here, and they've pointed out just how not far away that all feels. I don't have the direct experience that they do, but I will definitely agree with them in how they perceive that. So.
And one of the things that we were talking about, and I touched on a little bit in that overview, is as I was reading about it, there are some folks that are, a little bit like, wait, I don't want just a Black History Month, right? Black history is American history. Black history is history. Yeah. One of them, one of my favorite actors, Morgan Freeman. However, for me, I think of things like, Black history or Valentine's Day or women's history, or whenever we're celebrating, I think of it as a chance to focus on educating myself on a topic or like paying attention to reminding myself that it's important to me, not necessarily to limit it to that moment, but just kind of a reminder like, oh, this is a time to, remind myself to pull this information in and to give it some space. Not that this is the only time to pay attention to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, again, that's the real point of these sorts of things is to help everybody take a second and reflect and learn about something. So, like I said, I feel like it's incredibly valuable. One of the things that I did when you brought this up was I took something that was near and dear to my heart, which is music. And I've always been really into punk and other genres of music, but it occurred to me that it's one of those weird areas. And once you actually found an article when I kind of brought it up and we started talking about it, about just the concept of who actually started punk rock music.
Right. It was a bunch of white British guys, right?
No.
What? Are you kidding me?
So, and I admit this was one of those areas. I'm not a savant when it comes to music history and knowledge. I have a lot of it, and I know you expect that I am actually that. I'm not always up on things. So when you sent me an article that mentioned a band called Death, I realized that I had heard of them. I couldn't name anything they did, and for the most part, they weren't significant. They weren't around for very long. But they were a group of black musicians from Detroit that was actually intrigued by the sound of the Stooges, who I am very familiar with. And that was Iggy Pop, tail end of the 60s, before he went solo. They started taking what the 60s rock sound had been and turned it up a little bit. Iggy Pop at the time was pretty over the top. They lumped him in with glam and things like that at the time because they didn't really know what to do with him. He's sort of weird, like Bowie, but crazier. So, but Death, they had a lot of things to say. They were saying a lot of counterculture things, which, as they brought up in the article, was not something that was particularly popular with the fact that it was being said by black men, because counterculture was already a rough subject with the hippie movement and all of that, much less racial fears and things like that. So the general consensus was that in a industry, music, as it is, fairly white dominated, always has been, and it's business and all of that, they were sort of squashed. One of the things that I found really interesting was that there was a 2012 documentary made on them specifically that really talked about it. It's called A Band Called Death, and it was a deep look into how they were sort of mistreated by the industry at the time. And the reality is they're really harsh and hard. If you haven't gotten into them, you need to be prepared. It was early punk rock, but they were ahead of their time. And some would say that might have been part of the problem. They were doing something that didn't have a genre to land in at the time. So I would invite people to kind of look into the story, even if the music's not up your alley. But another thing that came up was a band that I totally knew and remembered and hadn't ever even thought about the significance of it. A band called Bad Brains. And they are easily mentioned, as we'll post up in an article. You know, they bring up the Misfits and Black Flag and Dead Kennedys and Circle Jerks and even the Clash as these pioneers of punk rock, and Bad Brains is absolutely in there. And I don't even really think about it, but they were a black punk band. And I've always liked what they did, you know, and lumped into that group of that genre of music that I like. But it was really significant. They were on that precursor and, you know, to where everything went. A lot of people don't realize that the punk scene was very short-lived. Now, there's plenty of bands that kept on making punk and stuff like that, but the reality is we moved on from that in the 80s to what was called post-punk. And with post-punk, what really happened was a lot of people that had that edgy attitude sort of spinned a little bit towards being more poppy. Mm-hmm. The goth scene kind of raised out of that. And so you have pop punk things. And the problem is there was a lot of women in them. They absolutely, the whole post-punk and even new wave scene embraced women. You've got people like Blondie and Patti Smith and Joan Jett and Susie Sue that really took off in that. But it was terrifically underrepresented with any black musicians. To this day, like that whole genre just never took off in it. So it was really kind of sad to see that while there have been a lot of punk bands that have carried on and things like that, it hasn't had as much of the black influence.
Right. Well, and it's funny because the article said something like, you know, if you Google punk rock history, you might not find the full story, and they're not wrong. Like death and bad brains are not mentioned.
Not usually.
In most of the summaries.
And like I said, I know of them. I know of bad brains for sure. And I knew they were black. And to me, I mean, I don't know what it means, but I just sort of thought, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
They're a black punk band. Neat. But I'm kind of realizing more of the significance of it because they would have been playing in front of crowds that would definitely not necessarily have known what to do with them at that time.
Yeah. And that to me is part of the point we were talking about of kind of digging into different parts of history and to really trying to notice Black history and to say, oh, wow, like these folks are pretty much left out of most of the stories of the beginning of that. And sure, maybe not a huge cross section of the country or population is interested in punk rock history, but I think it's something that happens a lot. And that's, how do we shift that?
Well, there's a little bit of a lack of credit, I think, in general. It's tough to call it appropriation, although it kind of is at times.
I think it is. I think it's like, especially in music, right? Because we get jazz, the same
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah, and jazz.
Even more egregiously.
Yes, traditionally, I think black musicians were always accepted in jazz as well as white musicians, but their contributions to it in the early days.
Well, the thing was that the white musicians were the ones that would get the contracts and the deals, right? Like the black musicians were pioneering the musical experience.
Oh, and thank God
then
for
the white
Motown.
musicians would,
Motown really changed that because
grab them and then go get the record deals and such.
Yeah, it's true. And Motown did change that a little bit in the pop side of things. It was totally okay to have black musicians in the 60s and 70s in the pop scene. So fortunately, that was one area where they did come up. And like I said, the history of Motown is a couple of shows in and of itself. But, back to my concept around appropriation, like, I don't know how many people would even realize that it was the influence of Jamaican music and adding in that Jamaican beat to things that led to ska and the various versions of the punk mixed with the reggae sound that became an entire genre as well. And that is one area where I feel like some of the black punkier musicians were able to land and express themselves, but even that in a lot of ways got whitewashed. Please see UB40 if you want to look up a whitewashed reggae band.
Ouch.
But the reality is the influence of that on the music, most people totally recognize that came from the Jamaican beats and things like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up and digging in a little bit. One of the things that I've really noticed as we've dug into a lot of different topics and definitely into more of like Black culture and Black history is that I really didn't get most of this in school. When we talk about history, and I went to a decent school, a lot of the stuff that I have learned around more of the history of minorities in our country, not just Black, but has been as an adult and reading and looking for it and searching it out. And to me, that's another kind of important thing to pay attention to is when we talk about what's happening in our country and some of the divisions that we face, I do feel like that lack of awareness contributes to it. White people, especially white people in the suburbs who aren't really connected to maybe a lot of minorities or people who look different from them, really live in a bubble. And they additionally maybe don't even get information through the educational channels, and so those bubbles are pretty strongly built.
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it. It's tribalism, and it's our bubbles, and it's our social media bubbles and things like that. And if you don't break out of that, it is very unlikely that you will ever find exposure to these sorts of things. And
you have to know that breaking out of it. Like, you don't know necessarily. I remember when I was in college, there was this American history essay contest, and this high schooler won the essay and got to read it at this Freedom Festival or something for the 4th of July. And I just remember this moment where she said, as she was reading it, that she'd never left the country. She'd never left the state of Utah. She'd never left the county she lived in. But she knew, without a doubt, that America was the best country in the world.
Yeah,
and and I just had this moment of like, oh, honey, like I'm not saying don't love your country. And ignorance doesn't necessarily mean you're right about what you're dealing with. Or often it doesn't. And additionally, that bubble, she didn't even know she was in a bubble. Like, she knew it enough to say she'd never left, but she didn't really get what that meant in terms of lack of exposure. And I just think that's the other thing we're dealing with. It's not just that people don't choose to break out. They don't even know necessarily
what to break out into.
Or that there's something to break out of.
So I actually have a suggestion that I would like to throw out there.
Okay.
And I'll bring it to music, but really it could be anything. If there's some sort of art or something that you are aware of, maybe a musician or musical group that you like that is Black, go and do a wiki dive and read about them and see where they interconnect with other things and other people they worked with, or what their influences were, how many chart-topping hits they have. It's not that hard to find things that are actually in your bubble and just explore them a little deeper. Kind of like with Bad Brains and realizing that it's a band that I liked. It's a band that I knew was Black, and I really don't know that much about them. So I'm going to go dig in and kind of just get to know their story a little bit. And that's one way that I can kind of celebrate what they accomplished. I mean, if our legacy is just to leave a legacy, it's out there. I can go and explore that. And it's an easy way to connect with them just as a musician that I like.
I really like that. And I would also say, seek out modern expressions that are happening maybe in your city or your town. Like there might be a Black History celebration occurring, or a local community center putting on a play. Like, go see what's happening in your community. And if there's something to break you out of the bubble that you might not know you're in.
Yeah.
Try something new.
We can even give a little peek behind the curtain. The fact of the matter is we have had a lot of guests that are Black that have a lot of stuff. A lot of them are activists, and that's come from a lot of the work that you've done as an activist, just making those connections and meeting them. And when we tell them what we're doing, they've generally always been excited to come on the show, and we're really privileged and honored to have them. But it's also been great just to have access to that sort of thing, to have some sit-down, eye-to-eye conversations with these men and women that we've had as guests, hear what they're doing, hear about things from their perspective, hear the things that make them excited or frighten them that are totally different and outside of our bubble. I'm not going to say that everybody's going to have access to doing that, but if you do, absolutely have a conversation, absolutely talk to people, and that's one of the reasons why we're committed, not just for Black people, but for everyone, from our latest shows on Christians that are looking at ways to be better in society, and women's rights or gay rights, any of that sort of thing. We've really tried to bring those outside perspectives that hopefully resonate with people, but might get other people listening to the show out of that bubble.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do feel honored that the number of folks that have been willing to come on the show and share their experiences and perspectives. I feel like we have a privilege to get to know so many different people and learn so much from them.
So with that in mind, hopefully you may be inspired to go do some searching and looking around, or deep dives into some subject, or interact in your community more and find out, what somebody's story is or something like that. How, who's your acquaintance or friend who happens to be Black's hero and why. It's just an interesting way to actually interact in your community and be a part of that.
Good advice.
You have to watch it. It's so good.
It was all right.
Your friends may have decent taste in movies, but their incoherent reviews are getting annoying.
I don't know. I just didn't like it.
Looking for a new podcast?
Join Time Sensitive, where we break down the recent movies you've heard of but may have missed.
Spoilers included.
And we get it. You're busy and can't see everything, but are you really going to track it down a year later?
We take the time so you don't have to.
Find us on Twitter @TSMoviePod and find out what we're watching.
I'm Sam.
I'm Ian.
And I'm Kate, and we're 3 friends and armchair movie critics. Seriously, invite us into your living room.
Kate, stop.
Listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
Time sensitive, because you deserve better.
Welcome to the BiCurean moment. So,
You're up.
I'm up. I had an interesting thing come up. It's been in the news over the last couple of weeks. And really, honestly, for the last couple of years, if anybody hasn't been paying attention, but it's just been on my mind lately. There's a Chinese company called Huawei. You may have heard of them. Generally, the news you hear about them is either something shady that they have done and been caught doing. There's an executive who's been imprisoned in Canada for a while and undergoing trial for certain aspects of business dealings. But the history of them is essentially they're a massive Chinese telecom company. And they're on par absolutely with, people like Verizon and the companies you've all heard of. But one of the more recent things that has come out is that there's evidence that they have used technology, backdoors in the technology that they have provided to spy on people. Now, I'm not much of the paranoid type, but people who've listened to this show enough might realize that I have some skepticism about privacy, especially on the internet and stuff. And a lot of that is just understanding. Google doesn't have to have your information, but you also don't have to use the internet. Likewise, Facebook doesn't have to have your information, but you don't have to use Facebook. And in the case of things like Huawei, Trump had actually even said, and it pains me to say, he might not be completely off on this, that he did not want them to have a contract to build like the new 5G networks in the United States, and had even gone so far as to say that countries that had Huawei build their 5G networks, like Germany was on the list of wanting to do that, a couple of others, we would have some limited interactions with them on that basis. Why? Because there's this fear, with evidence coming out to back it up, that the Chinese government, which has a major stake in Huawei as part of that whole weird communist/capitalist model that they're now operating under, they absolutely can use that. So it's made me think that as we get more reliant on technology, are we even aware? And maybe it's not even Huawei. Like, we certainly have hopefully some healthy skepticism and lack of trust, but with companies like Google, Apple, and Facebook, for obvious reasons, things that have come out. But the other side of that is, how do we even know if, the next big company that gets a contract, if they're shady, we might not even know how they're going to utilize that technology in a bad way or whatever. So it's just been on my mind.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning. And the thing that really concerns me is there's honestly so much, noise around all of it. It's really hard to feel like I get enough information that I can feel is accurate to properly participate,
I mean, we got to rely on like random news stories in USA Today or whatever that just say, there's evidence that Huawei's using technology this way. It's like, oh no. But what do you even do with that information? Do we stop using our cell phones, the internet, computers? What can we trust? What's actually going on with things? It's concerning.
Yep.
But the reality is we live in a world where that stuff's going to happen. And with so much of our technology made in Asia, it's easy to build in backdoors. One of the things that actually gave me some hope was that even when pressed by the federal government in the U.S., Apple refused to hack their own phone to get information in a criminal case, simply stating that the one thing that they really valued was privacy, and even if it's relevant, they'd rather protect privacy. It's a weird double-edged sword, but some part of that actually makes me feel a little bit better that the companies will actually hold integrity and not just sell out somebody using an iPhone when the government's like, we need in here. So
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, checks and balances, right?
So that's just more of a public service announcement. Keep an eye on things. I don't,
They're watching you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's our public service
Yeah,
announcement.
They're watching. Get
They're
your
listening.
tinfoil hat. Let's
They're
go.
listening. They're watching. Don't feel at any way safe.
No. We'll see where it goes.
See where it goes. Oh, so my BiCurean moment is another take sort of on the opioid crisis. I was reading an article about in Missouri, and I want to get this correct, so I'm going to pull this up here. Missouri is implementing some programs to try and get people onto different pain management systems. And one of the things that they're talking about in this situation is that we have this narrative right now that the opioid crisis is manufactured by these pharmaceutical companies who were deceptive, right? Like there's this...
The general consensus is that they force doctors to overprescribe.
And so there are some folks who are saying, actually, it's structural. He says it's not just that they're overprescribing or underprescribing a certain kind of medication, because as you mentioned, the underprescribing situation is also very real. People who have pain can't get access because of the fears around abuse. However, prescribers are finding that even in this program in Missouri, where they're being given a lot of latitude and even some funding to try and give patients more options, not a lot of patients are taking advantage of it. Like it's a very small percentage. And some of them, the doctors are like, I would love to send my patient to a chiropractor. They don't have the time because they work 9 to 5 in a manufacturing job, and their insurance doesn't cover it. But their insurance will totally cover if I prescribe them OxyContin for their pain. And so the structural issues are this ongoing challenge that we have around how healthcare is managed and the ways in which doctors actually don't have the freedom to prescribe the care that they think is best for their patient, because they have to prescribe the care that their patient has access to funding for. And each insurance plan has a very different set of parameters for that.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was kind of an important thing to realize, is that, yes, there may have been or definitely was some inappropriate behavior by the pharmaceutical companies. However, when we talk about doctors just prescribing pills, we also have to remember that they have a lot of constraints, and some of that, a lot of that has to do with insurance. It's also access, like they were talking about healthcare deserts. There's places where you can't see a doctor because they can't make enough money to provide care in that area, and there's not a lot of alternatives. If there is a doctor, there's not necessarily an acupuncturist or a pain management specialist or whatever it is that they might send you to in lieu of the medication.
Yeah.
So I felt like it was important to acknowledge that and some of it is, we are in this larger debate about Medicaid for all or universal health care. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's just like anything else. Like if your situation is slightly different, you might not have access to a host of things that you think everybody has access to.
Yeah. No, I this one's near and dear to my heart, as I am a chronic pain sufferer. And the truth is, it's very difficult. I worked with my doctor over the course of a year to finally get a recommendation, referral to go to a pain management specialist, which seemed like maybe this would be a way of dealing with it. And that pain management specialist ended up being pretty heavily focused on physical therapy and multiple times a week. And I just don't have the freedom and time to really do that. I'm not even saying I want pills, and I might need to start looking at something, but the regimen that I was looking at was not doable. But to your point, the structural issue, that is really the problem. We have this thing that feels like the insurance companies they basically have this view of how treatment works. They will allow for, after a car accident, they'll allow for a few trips to, physical therapy. They don't normally cover things like chiropractics. They always have great prescription plans or something that makes the prescriptions work. And we've built this. It's as much the doctors working with the insurance companies, working with just our modern takes on medicine. It's never a holistic view. It's quick, short treatments that spend as little money as possible, don't tend to actually address overall issues. We've even gotten to the point where preventative care is suffering because of these constraints. So it seems obvious to say things like our medical system is broken, but the reality is I think we need to look at why, like what's happening, what's going on that's leading to this. If pills are not the answer, then let's find a better answer. But we need the doctors and insurance companies and everyone to kind of buy in. Right.
Well, and I think what you said about the cost, I really do feel like for-profit healthcare is problematic on its own. And, I just remember when I was in my early 20s, I had my wisdom teeth out. And I'm calling, it's the first time I do one on my own, and I'm calling to find out what my benefits are. And they said, well, the anesthesia is optional. I was like, they're going to dig into my gums and rip a tooth out. What do you mean that's optional?
Yeah.
They're like, no, yeah, well, you like the Novocaine and all of that was optional. They would cover.
I.e., you're going to be charged
right.
for it. They're not covering.
Right. And so they were like, I was just like, are you serious? And I asked the person, because I'm me, I asked them, I said, so have you ever had this done? Would you do it without that? Would it be optional for you? They did not want to answer my question. So at any rate, so I guess I said it was opioids, but I think actually more I just mean that I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a structural situation that we're dealing with.
There needs to be a solution. And that's what it really comes down to is let's start looking at holistic health care and stop throwing pills at the problem. As many doctors maybe did it for a shady reason or because there was grift going on from the pharmaceutical companies. Why are they even allowed to grift? Why aren't the doctors making decisions for the best interest of the patient? Why aren't they being educated on the options to share with the patient? They always tell you if you have a question, go ask your doctor. But what if they don't know?
Right.
So
yeah, it's really true.
And on that note, thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can give us a call at 720-507-7309. And our email is podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice. It makes a big difference.
Thank you.